It is a genuine pleasure to introduce Dr. Haroon Akram-Lodhi as tonight's speaker for the 2017 Al Berry Lecture. Given the many similarities that Haroon and Al share, one would be hard-pressed to find a more qualified individual to give this address. Though he is sometimes reluctant to admit it, Haroon, like Al, is a development economist. In fact, like Al, Haroon is among the foremost political economists and development economists in Canada, and arguably the world. Both Haroon and Al have long argued that social and economic inequalities are a primary impediment to the development process. And both have advocated for more just and egalitarian trajectories of development. This is particularly so in their scholarship on agrarian change, where both Haroon and Al have produced highly influential works highlighting the contributions of small-scale and peasant farms to food security and agricultural development, even as they have identified the dominant political and economic processes that undermine rural livelihoods. As such, both have been at the vanguard of critical agrarian studies, and indeed highly influential in Ryan's own scholarly development. And Ryan then mentions, I might also add that they have both been invaluable mentors and role models. As I'm sure those of you who know them would agree, both are good souls and incredibly affable individuals. Haroon holds a number of academic posts, too many to list for you tonight. Among them, however, it is worth noting that he is a professor of Economics and International Development Studies at Trent University. He is the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Development Studies, which has been, in speaking with Haroon earlier, has been rising up the scale of development studies journals in the world under his leadership. He is a fellow at Food First, the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and he's a poverty and gender analyst for the UN's Environment Program. As these positions suggest, Haroon is a leading scholar in the fields of IDS, critical food studies, and feminist economics. Indeed, he has published some 40 peer-reviewed articles, 33 book chapters, and 6 books on these topics. Tonight, he will be addressing us on Feeding the Future, Understanding the Contemporary Food Crisis. And as students from Ryan's own Political Economy of Food course, a third-year course in the IDS program, here at UTSC can attest, we couldn't have a more qualified individual to speak on this topic. In that class, Ryan uses the most recent of Haroon's 6 books called Hungry for Change, Farmers, Food Justice, and the Agrarian Question. In this book, Haroon demonstrates his rich knowledge of agrarian change, food regimes, and rural livelihoods in a variety of developing contexts. And he does so in a manner that is at once highly informative, yet eminently readable. Ryan, Haroon expects nothing less from you for your talk tonight. Please welcome Haroon.
How can I live up to that? Okay, first, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Chris, how long do I have? 20 minutes.
50 minutes, an hour?
50 minutes or an hour. Okay, that's more than enough time. Okay, well, the first thing I want to say to everyone is how much of a pleasure and an honor it is to follow in the likes of the footsteps of Geeta Sen, Vijay Prashad, but most especially my friend Tanya Murray-Lee, who was last year's Al Berry Lecturer. These really are world-class figures in international development studies, and quite frankly, I don't feel I deserve to follow them. So I'm really it's quite an honor to follow in their footsteps. But more particularly, it's a very great honor to be the Al Berry Lecturer. Oh, I need that. And that's because, although Al and I first met only about 8 years ago, I've had a very long relationship with his work. With one particular work, 1979. It was early classic. In October of 1983, when I, like most of you in this room, was an undergraduate, this book was on my required reading list. Terry Byers, who assigned this, was, I'm sure Al would agree, a harsh critic of a lot of the positions that were taken in the book. But at the same time, Terry deeply respected the meticulous character of the work and the rigor with which the work was carried out. Al himself is a towering figure in examining rural change. And as Paul said from Ryan, in many ways my own career trajectory has followed many of the same themes and many of the same ideas that Al is engaged with over the course of his professional life. And the thing is, I still engage with the ideas. My most recent work that I'm working on right now engages indirectly with some of the work from this publication of 1979. So it's a huge honor to be an Al Berry Lecturer. Okay, so let's get to the meat and potatoes of it. I want to start by saying to you that we live in a very different era in 2017 than really even only 20 years ago. Several things have happened which makes the world a different kind of place. I want to identify three because they're quite central to what I'm going to talk about. The first change, global population. 10 years ago, sometime around May, the world population for the first time became more urban than rural. For the entirety of our species' history, we had been principally living outside settled communities. But from now on and for the rest of our history, the majority of us are going to live in cities. Major change in human history. Second, sometime around October 2011, the world population passed the 7 billion mark for the first time. And we are moving inexorably towards the 8 billion mark. But there's also very significant population changes within countries, the most notable of which is that sometime around 2020, India will surpass China as the largest population in the world. So that's one change, demographic shifts that we haven't seen before. The second fundamental change, climate change. We see it in the hurricanes that have afflicted the Caribbean coast and the Caribbean islands. We see it in the wildfires that we've seen in California and out west. And we've seen it when we've experienced 30-degree temperatures in southern Ontario in late October. In fact, I don't think climate change is actually a very good word anymore. I think we might actually start saying climate chaos is probably a better description of what we see. And then the third change is the global financial and economic crisis. It started in 2008, and as a consequence of it, the world entered, particularly the rich world, entered into a period of deep and profound economic austerity. And the implications of that financial and economic crisis continue to reverberate. In some places, it is moderating. But I would argue that the moderation that's occurred in the past few years is actually temporary, and the next crisis is coming. Now, the thing about these three elements, population, climate, economic crisis, these are all connected. And you may not realize it, but I hope to show to you that these are actually all connected to food. And so in trying to understand our contemporary world, food is at the heart of that understanding. So let's look at these three changes and try and understand what's causing them before we look at the way in which food intersects through them. So the starting point is population. World population dramatically took off after 1850, and even more dramatically took off after 1950, especially in developing countries. Over the course of this century, but even more particularly over the course of the last 50 years, we've seen an unparalleled increase in the numbers of people living in the world. In this chart, which you can't see very well, but it's nonetheless there, and we will distribute the slides later, we have the UN Population Division's estimates of May of 2017 for planetary population. And they estimate that in 2100, the world will have somewhere on the order of 11.2 billion people. Now you might say, well, how can you know what the population is going to be in 83 years? But in actual fact, of all the social sciences, statistical demography is probably the most reliable. In 1950, the UN Population Division did an estimate of planetary population in 2010, so 60 years forward, and they were off by 0.3%. Really quite remarkable. So planetary population projections are probably quite reliable. Over the course of the last 50 years, there's been a massive acceleration in global population. And this begs an important question. Can the world support a population of 11 billion people? Indeed, if we have 7.6 billion, can the world even support 7.6 billion? Can the world's finite resources manage? And more particularly, is it not the case that if you have so many people, don't we have to live in a world that's hungry? The current estimate of the numbers of hungry people in the world as of this year from the Food and Agriculture Organization is 815 million. Now the numbers of those who are estimated to be hungry came down by over 200 million over 20 years. But as the chart shows, in the last few years, the number is rising again, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Southeast Asia and in Western Asia. And this year, for the first time in 6 years, the UN declared a district in South Sudan as having experienced a famine. And more recently, the UN has declared, of course, that Yemen is on the brink of a catastrophic famine in which millions are at risk. And Yemen and South Sudan are not the only places in the world at risk from famine. So we see the rising hunger and the specter of famine returning to the world. But it's important to be very cautious about headline figures, 815 million people hungry. It's important always, as students, to read the fine print. Why should you read the fine print? The estimate of 815 million people is based on the caloric intake that's needed for a sedentary life. A sedentary life. But undernourished people can't be sedentary. You've got to go out and look for work. You've got to go out and look for some cash. You've got to be active. And if we adjust the caloric intake that's needed upwards to that for a physically active life, the number of people hungry in the world is in fact 1.35 billion, and that number has not really changed very much in 45 years. Now in either instance, whether you want to take the 815 million or whether you want to take the 1.35 billion figure, we live in a world of widespread chronic hunger. And it's a very common, very popular, and I would say somewhat intuitive belief that in some way population pressures must have an effect on hunger, that a food crisis should be connected to growing population. Now this kind of argument, that food and population are connected, this argument originates with the Reverend Thomas Malthus, writing in the 18th century, and his argument was a very simple one. That food and other resources, that they grow arithmetically, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. But population grows geometrically, 2 squared, which is squared, which is squared, which is squared. So Malthus's basic belief was that at some point, population growth must be faster than the growth of food, and this then will cause hunger as a means of re-establishing some kind of balance between food and population, an idea which we call in international development food availability decline. Malthus was very blunt about it. He said, quote, "The power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must, in some shape, visit the human race." Now, a belief in food availability decline has produced a widely held view that the current numbers of the hungry are precisely driven by growth of population being faster than the growth of food availability. And it's argued that because population is growing faster than food availability by these people, that prices have to go up. There's too many people, not enough food, and so demand is forcing up the price of food. And so between 2007 and 2013, we witnessed very rapid increases in the global price of food. At 2013, food prices spiked to historically unparalleled levels. They then started to come down, but it should be said that in 2017, now, food prices are still 35% higher than they were prior to the 2007 food price spike. And if you're poor and living on $1.90 a day or $2.50 a day, and your food is 35% higher than it was 10 years ago, you're devoting so much more of your income, which is limited to food, that it places stress on your household. These record food prices over the last 10 years generated in the international development studies community a view that there's a food crisis, which is part of the title of my talk. And there was one. For a short period, at least 150 million people were pushed back into the poverty from which they'd only recently emerged. The global numbers of those who were poor temporarily crossed a threshold of 1 billion in official statistics. And for many, the specter of a Malthusian crisis was resurrected. But, and there's always a but, for population growth to cause increases in food prices, hunger and food crisis in a Malthusian type of way, you have to demonstrate two things. Number one, that population growth is greater than the growth of food supplies. Population growth is greater than the growth of food supplies. Second thing you have to demonstrate, that increases in the demand for food are caused by increases in population. So let us look at both, starting with population growth and food. So here we have a 31-year period where we look at world cereal production, starting in 1981. And what you see over a 31-year period is world cereal production steadily goes up. But this is only total production of world cereals. We want to take account of population. So what we're interested in is food production per person. What's the trend in food production per person, not total food production? So here we have a second chart. Per person food production over a 48-year period starting in 1961, ending in 2009. The data in these two charts comes from the Food and Agriculture Organization's FAOSTAT, their statistical database. Anyone can download these figures, and if I can create these charts, anyone can. What do you see in this chart? First of all, world food supplies is the blue line. And what do you see? Per person over a 48-year period, it steadily goes up. It's driven particularly by the green line and the yellow line, which starts at a lower per person production than world supplies. The green line is Asia, the yellow line is South America. And their trend growth in food production is faster than the growth in world food production. And then we have Africa. And what you see is that per person food production in Africa declines to between 1981 and 1982, and then starting in 1982 starts to increase inexorably, so that by 2009 per person food production in Africa is higher than it was in 1961. And in this light, it's useful to think, how much food is being produced? Well, The average person requires around 2,100, 2,200 kilocalories a day in order to be able to manage. Here we have daily calories globally from around the world, starting in 1970. And in 1970, there were more than 2,100 or 2,200 kilocalories produced per person per day in the world. And in 2010, we're moving up towards 3,000 kilocalories per day. But we only need 2,100 or 2,200. And by 2050, we'll be up and over 3,000 calories a day. So, the world produces more than enough food to feed the existing population that we have. Indeed, according to the World Food Program, there's enough food today that's being produced to feed upwards of 10 billion people. And that's going to be the global population around 2050. So we're already producing enough food to feed people in 33 years' time. So we need to be very careful about claims that we need to double food production by 2050, which is a very common claim that's made. Yeah? The idea that you should double food production by 2050 is based upon the entire world adopting what some people call the standard American diet, or SAD. More reasonably, we probably need to increase global food production by about 60% by 2100. But this leads, I would argue, to an even more disturbing question. If the world produces enough food for 10 billion people, if we have record food production, why are so many people undernourished? A starting point in answering that is to address my second question. Are record food prices caused by a growing demand for food, which is at least in part driven by a growing population? Let me answer the question first, and then I'll explain why I've come up with the answer. And the answer to the question is, there is a growing demand for food, but this is not caused by population. There's three key reasons why the demand for food has been growing over the course of the past 20 years. The first one is biofuels. Between 2000 and 2010, the ethanol industry massively expanded in the rich world, and most particularly in the United States and in the European Union, where government intervention not only subsidized biofuels, but also protected biofuels in order to create a market for them by mandating that biofuels be mixed with your gas. In the United States, the biofuels industry 5 years ago was responsible for buying 35% of the maize crop, a crop which is very heavily subsidized by the United States government. Rising production of biofuels diverts food into fuel, while at the same time driving up the demand for crops. And that partially explains why prices go up, because the demand for food is driven by the demand for fuel, particularly as fuel prices rose during the heyday of the Iraq War. But over the course of the last 7 years, for better or worse, in the United States in particular, there has been a massive expansion of fracking. And the effect of this has been to increase US energy supplies while at the same time cutting the price of energy. And in this light, it's increasingly clear in 2017 that subsidized biofuel production is becoming more and more uneconomic. And this has led some, in financial markets in particular, to conclude that biofuel production will, for the foreseeable future, come down, and that cropland will no longer be used to produce food for fuel. But back in 2007 through 2012, 2013, there is no doubt that biofuel production forced up food prices in part. Second driver of this increase, financial speculation. Finance responds to movements in prices, And in 2007, the price of food, as we saw in an earlier chart, shot up. And in the wake of the ongoing financial crisis in the United States, institutional investors on Wall Street moved into food-based financial instruments in a big way, in an effort to boost the earnings of their firms, but also in an effort to boost the bonuses which went into their own pockets. And so, on the upper left-hand side, we have the increase in the value of assets in food. And you can see it rose quite dramatically. Below it, you see that the composition of these financial assets switch. In 1996, financial assets in food were primarily dominated by traders in food. But by 2011, financial speculators dominated the financial assets in food. And this spurred price increases, which is the upper right-hand chart. The upper right-hand chart shows two things. On the horizontal axis, the price increases when you go to the right of the 0 point. On the vertical axis, the net index, that's the buying and the selling of futures contracts, both short-term and long-term. If your net index is positive, you're buying more contracts than you're selling. So we're interested again in being above the horizontal axis. And what you see then in the upper right-hand side is many agricultural commodities in which there's a positive correlation between net buying of contracts and price increases. And although it may seem that they're all clustered, I stress to you that the horizontal axis has a very large scale. It starts at 0 and goes to 200, right? So there is a correlation between buying futures contracts and price increases. Agro-commodity-linked financial instruments became a key investment vehicle for companies like Goldman Sachs. In 2012, Goldman Sachs made $400 million betting on movements in the price of food staples, and the partners that made those bets got very good bonuses at the end of the year. Finance pushes food prices higher and then makes them far more volatile than is previously the case, because trading strategies in finance are an effort to hoard contracts, to hoard these futures contracts in order to corner markets so that profit can be extracted in the market for contracts. As a result of this, the farm economy has become unhinged from the financialized food economy. And the demand for agri-food contracts does feed through to your food prices. There's a quote that I've got here by George Soros. George Soros is a financial speculator par excellence. And he has said that commodity index buying strategies are, here's the quote, intellectually unsound, potentially destabilizing, and distinctly harmful in their economic consequences. And that's a speculator. Second factor then, financial speculation. What's the third driver of the increase in demand for food? The third driver is changing diets, and particularly what Tony Weiss calls meatification. Increasingly, the demand for grain is not driven by the demand to feed people, but the demand to feed animals. As societies switch from a high-starch, low-protein diet to a high-protein, low-starch diet, something that we call the gastronomic transition. And this has dramatically increased meat consumption on a global scale to well above 40 kilos per person. But this global average of 40 kilos of meat consumed per year per person, in fact, masks very significant differences around the world. Poultry production has driven meatification as companies like Tyson industrialized chicken production in confined animal feeding operations to meet near limitless demand for chicken. As my friend Gerardo Otero describes it, chicken is the neoliberal food par excellence. Beef has become a lesser proportion of global meat consumption. But that really isn't the point. The issue here is that the absolute amount of beef that is eaten has grown astronomically. And this is an issue because beef is the most inefficient form of meat production that we know of. it requires 8 kilocalories of energy in to produce 1 kilocalorie of energy out. It is a reverse protein-calorie machine, in the words of Francis Moore-Lappé. So the increased demand for food grains has been driven by an increased demand for meat. But there's also huge global differences in that demand for meat. Here in Canada and in the United States, average meat consumption is 120 kilos per person per year. Now you say, I don't eat meat. And I find that figure just astonishing. In China, it's about 60 kilos per person. In developing countries as a whole, it's less than 30 kilos per person. And if you look at South Asia has hardly budged. 1.2 billion people, but average meat consumption of less than 10 kilos per person per year. It's also useful to note that increasing wealth is not necessarily associated with rising meat consumption. If you look at Western Europe, in the early 1980s, the growth of meat consumption started to stabilize and level off as health concerns outweighed the need for people to consume more meat. I would argue that it's not rising demand for meat in rapidly growing developing countries like China which drives the increase in the demand for meat. Chinese meat consumption has grown a lot. But I would suggest that it's continually increasing meat demand in rich countries, and the deepening meatification of our diets that drives up the demand for grain and thus pushes up the prices of those grains. So, biofuels, financial speculation, meatification. Over the course of the past 10 years, these are the things that have driven record food prices by channeling food supplies into less efficient and less effective ways of feeding people. This is not the result of population growth. The demand for food isn't driven by population growth. The rising demand for food grains and the diversion of those food grains into not directly feeding people is instead a consequence of the globalization of the world food system. Our current world food system coalesced in the mid-1990s and is characterized by several things. Firstly, it is predicated on the massive use of hydrocarbons. Second, it's dominated by global agri-food transnational corporations, which are driven by financial market imperatives of showing their profitability every 3 months, short-term profit maximization. Our current food system is characterized globally by a supermarket revolution which propels relentless food commodification. And these supermarkets and their suppliers use information technologies and historically unsurpassed logistical capabilities. They do this to forge global animal protein commodity chains based upon the globalization of confined animal feeding operations. And they use transgenic organisms as a principal input into those food grains that are used to feed animals. And those food grains are grown on large-scale, monocultural, capital-intensive, extractivist mega farms in the United States, in Brazil, in Argentina, yes, in Canada, and elsewhere. This is a world food system that supplies mass-produced, standardized, durable, processed food based upon soy, high fructose corn syrup, salt. This is produced for the global middle classes. These foods have lower profit margins per unit, and so the supermarkets have to sell you more of them in order to make money from them. While at the same time, this food system sells to us healthy, nutritional, fresh, organic, green foods. These can be sold in lower volumes because their profit margins are much higher. And these are sold to the global elite. This is a food system sustained by governments, international institutions, but also by big philanthropy. There are 4 points that I want to make about this contemporary food system. The first point. Here's a picture of the world food system 10 years ago. I'd love to update this chart. It was produced by the International Food Policy Research Institute, and the person who did it, Joachim van Braun, I wrote to him a few months ago and said, please update it. And he said, that's a good idea, but I don't have the money to do it. So, in 2007, the world food economy in total was worth about $7 trillion. $7 trillion. Now let's look at the distribution of that value across the food system. Starting with farmers. 450 million farms, the vast majority of which are under 2 hectares, and a small number of which are over 100 hectares. Farmers captured $1.6 trillion out of a total of $7 trillion. Not a lot. Then, a lot of us like to cast the evil corporation in the food system as Monsanto, which has recently merged with Bayer. But if you look at agricultural input suppliers, the top 10 of them in 2007 only captured $40 billion of a $7 trillion market. They're not where the power lies. But look at the retailers. The top 10 global retailers captured $1 trillion out of $7 trillion of the total value in the world food system. The world food system is one in which supermarkets are able to shape the structure of how the system operates. Now, it's important to say that concentration is also found elsewhere. Here's a beautiful chart that was published just last week, so you get to see it for the first time. And it looks at the same diagram that I've just presented, but looks at concentration across various segments. And what you see is the agricultural commodity traders. These are the companies buying and selling grains. 10 companies control 90% of the market. Animal pharmaceuticals, 10 companies control 75% of the market. Agrochemicals, 5 companies, 84% of the market. Seeds, 10 companies, 73% of the market. This is a highly concentrated food system. And this is not just globally concentrated, and concentrated with particular segments being very powerful, particularly the supermarkets. This kind of power also applies at the national level. I wish I could do this for Canada, but no one's done it. But I do have a figure for the Netherlands. And you see the same thing. You see a gradual narrowing of the food chain down to fewer and fewer purchasing companies, supermarket concepts, and then supermarkets themselves. So we live in a world in which the food system is highly concentrated, yeah? Where there's very strong tendencies to what myself as an economist would call oligopoly, a few companies dominating markets, or what some people might call monopolistic tendencies in the global economy. It's worth thinking about the behemoths in the room. And the particular behemoth would be the supermarket. So here are the top 10 grocery retailers in the world. And these top 10 grocery retailers are dominated by Walmart, but you also see the Schwarz Group, which owns Lidl, Lidl being a dominant German discount supermarket. You see Kroger, American regional supermarket, Aldi, again a German discount supermarket, Costco, Carrefour, Tesco, and then 7&I, which is a Japanese supermarket format. Walmart. Now, the first thing you'll say to me is, Walmart just doesn't sell food, which of course is true. None of these companies rely solely on the sale of food. But they derive a lot of their revenues from food. In 2015, Walmart's revenues were $482 billion. $482 billion, of which 3/4 of their sales were in the United States. 90% of Americans live within 10 miles of a Walmart, and in 2015, 4 out of 5 Americans shopped in a Walmart. Now, groceries account for $1 of every $2 that Walmart makes. 1 out of every 2. Moreover, grocery sales in Walmart account for $1 out of every $4 spent in the United States. 1 out of every $4 spent in a Walmart. This is a high degree of corporate concentration in markets which can be strongly regulated by these dominant companies which shape the operation of the world food system. And so the choice that we witness as the prices are rolled back is a choice which is embedded within a fewer and fewer companies controlling ever larger segments of the market. This is nicely illustrated in Britain. Top diagram, in which you see over the period between 1992 and 2008, the top 4 supermarket retailers in the United Kingdom went from having 55% of the market to having over 75% of the market. So growing concentration. And what drives that concentration? Why do they want to concentrate? Part of the answer, the bottom part of the chart, the profitability of them. I chose 2 data points in estimating, in showing profitability figures. Remember, of course, Walmart just doesn't sell food, but 1 out of every $2 is food. And what do you see? In 2006, $11.3 billion in net profits. In 2012, $16.6 billion in net profits, an increase of 47%. Remember what I said earlier. 2007, food prices start to spike and continue to rise to 2011, the food price crisis. Looks like Walmart had a pretty good crisis. Tesco, largest retailer of food in the United Kingdom. Profits don't go up by nearly as much, but it's still in excess of 22%. Again, a good crisis for Tesco. And just as with Walmart and the supermarkets, a number of other agri-food transnationals in input supply and in food trading have had a very good crisis. These are 3 of the 4 main food traders in the world. We call them A, B, C, D. Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. Louis Dreyfus is private, so it does not publish its profits. But if you look at it, well, you know, crisis wasn't bad for them. So too for food manufacturers. Here we have 2015 profitability in terms of operating profit, but also the return on equity for AB InBev, which sells 1 out of every 3 pints of beer sold on the planet. Kraft Heinz and Nestle. They did pretty well. So, the missing link in trying to understand the operation of our world food system. What links together record hunger, record harvests, record prices? It's record profits. Profits drive the world food system, not need. Not need. So that's the first point I want to make about our food system. Second point about our food system goes back to the distinctions between the types of food sold in these supermarkets. As I said, processed food, which relies on soy, which relies on high fructose corn syrup, and which relies on salt. These have low margins per unit, so you have to shift large volumes of product, which means that when you're eating these processed foods, you're consuming large volumes of what some nutritionists would call bad sugars, particularly high fructose corn syrup. And the consumption of those bad sugars increases the energy that you take into your body, resulting in a global obesity crisis, which correlates with the energy intake emerging from the high consumption that people have of processed foods. And this places a huge burden on the global economy. Why are you taking in so much energy? It's because despite all that we know and all that you read, we continue to consume huge amounts of what in the chart is called packaged food and what I'm calling processed food. There is still a large number of people for whom processed food, mass-produced, standardized, durable, this has a strong allure. In food studies, we often call this type of food Fordist food because it's always the same, no matter where you're consuming it. And a consequence of the consumption of this Fordist food is increasing costs to all of us. Researchers argue now that more people are going to die every year from diet-related diseases than die from hunger. And if we add the number of undernourished in the world to the number of overnourished in the world, 4 out of every 10 people in the world are malnourished. And if we add the number of people with micronutrient deficiencies, that's a lack of a particular compound. It might be vitamin A, it might be iron, it might be something else. But if we add the numbers with micronutrient deficiencies to those who are undernourished and those who are overnourished, 4 billion people in the world out of 7.6 billion are malnourished. We have a food system which creates mass malnourishment. It just takes different forms in different places. And the cost of this is huge. During the American occupation of Iraq, as part of the so-called War on Terror, the United States spent $1 billion a week. What follows the War on Terror as a burden on the world economy? It's our diet. But I don't see us spending $1 billion a week fighting the war on obesity. So that's the second consequence of our world food system. It's a bad diet. Third issue. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The Conference of the Parties are meeting in Bonn right now. Has noted that the contemporary world food system is based upon a model of production, a model of distribution, and a model of consumption, which, because it is so hydrocarbon dependent, contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, worsens climate change, and degrades the very ecological foundations of farm production. Food crisis is linked to climate crisis. And it goes deeper than that, because it's not just hydrocarbon dependence of agriculture which contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Around a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions can be linked to global agriculture. But meatification is especially implicated in agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. Beef and pig production contributes more than 7% of all greenhouse gas emissions. It's an awful lot, so you can have your Big Mac. And moreover, the ecological impact of meatification leaves what can only be described as a scar on the planet. These are pictures of Texas feedlots from 2013. They're not paintings, they're pictures. They really do look like scars on the planet. As Tony Weiss has so eloquently put it, we live in a world food system which has a massive ecological hoofprint, which is only getting bigger. So food provides a missing link between population and hunger, economic crisis, and ecological crisis. The fourth point then, and final one that I want to make about this food system, has to deal with the place of smallholder farmers in it. In the mid-1990s, world market prices were established for agricultural products. Now what this means is that small-scale farmers around the world no longer face prices which reflect their costs of production, because the prices that they get for their products are not set locally. Prices in the agri-food system are set in financial centers like Chicago, like London, like New Orleans, and indeed like Winnipeg. And because prices are not set locally to reflect the costs which small-scale farmers face, these small-scale farmers are unable to compete against the subsidized exports of the United States and the European Union, which dumps food onto world markets, resulting in an undercutting of the crops that small-scale farmers are producing, an inability to sell their products in the wake of dumped agricultural commodities. And so small-scale farmers face what could be called a simple reproduction squeeze. They cannot cover their costs of production, and this generates a deepening global agrarian crisis. This global agrarian crisis takes different forms in different spaces and different places. But there has nonetheless been a fundamental shift in what 120 years ago came to be called the agrarian question, which investigates whether, and if so how, the transformation of rural society is taking place in ways which are detrimental to small-scale farmers, detrimental socially, detrimental economically, and detrimental ecologically. Understanding the agrarian question requires focusing upon what Henry Bernstein has called the 4 key questions of political economy. Who owns what? What is the pattern of ownership of assets in an economy? In a rural economy, that's land. In an urban economy, it's other things. But who owns? Second question, who does what? That's a question about work. Where are people working? And who are they working for? His third question, who gets what? Where do the incomes flow to? Where do the profits flow to? Where do the rents flow to? And his fourth question, what do they do with those incomes? What do they do with those profits? What do they do with those rents? These 4 changes align with changes that we can see in agricultural production and growth that we witness both on a global scale, but which you also witness on the ground when you go into rural communities around the world, whether we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa or Asia, which is where I go, or whether you're talking about Latin America. Now, as I've said earlier, the organization of production and distribution is dominated by global supermarkets. But the actual production of food for supermarkets, as I noted, is dominated by monocultural, capital-intensive, extractivist agricultural megafarms. Here in Canada, they can get to 30,000 acres. In Latin America, they can get in excess of 100,000 acres. This sector of farming does not operate in the interests of smallholder farmers, the 1.5 billion people that increasingly find it difficult to be able to make a living. These same patterns we see here in Canada. This is a chart from a paper which is in pre-publication, of which I'm a co-author, and this is the distribution of net market incomes in Canadian farming, according to the 2014 census. And what we see in Canada is that the vast bulk of net farm income accrues to a small sector of those farms which generate the highest net farm income. So you're seeing an increasing stratification of farms between less viable smallholder farms in Canada and large-scale, capital-intensive, extractivist farms. And that stratification you witness not just in Canada, it's also present in the United States, it's present in Brazil, but you also see it throughout the developing world. And this process of stratification, as larger scale farms reap more and more of the income generated in the farming sector, which, as we've seen, is only a fraction of the total value generated in the food system. This is a reason why 3/4 of the world's poor people live in the countryside, working primarily, but not exclusively, as farmers, and are increasingly women. They're hungry because they cannot compete on the basis of world market prices. And as a result, they fall into debt, and they're forced eventually, because they can't pay their debts in Canada and elsewhere, to give up farming, to give up their livelihoods, and leave the land. They form, in effect, a relative surplus population as what Mike Davis calls the planet of slums expands. These are the processes which explain the hunger that we see in our world food system. It bypasses a significant number of those that cannot compete in globalized farming or have been driven off the land and work in poorly paid, insecure, and frequently dangerous informal work. This year, in circumstances which didn't exist when I started in this business or when Al started in this business, the global hungry get their food not by growing it, but by using money in food markets. And that's true no matter where you go. And this is precisely the thing that the global hungry don't have. They don't have the money to buy the food that's there. So no money and you're hungry. And that doesn't matter whether you're in Sao Paulo, whether you're in Sihanoukville, or whether you're in Scarborough. And so the hungry are denied entitlements to food as a result of the normal, routine, and everyday working of a world food system that creates, that produces systemic hunger by excluding a significant proportion of the world's population from it. In a nutshell, hunger is not about scarcity. It's about the economics of global inequality. And it has to be stressed that this hunger is a violation of fundamental individual and collective rights, as laid out in the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says very concretely that everyone has a right to food. So we need to construct a new food system, a food system that ensures a right to food, access to adequate, sufficient, safe, sustainable, and culturally appropriate food that should be available to everyone as a right of citizenship. So what type of food system would that be? There are two falsehoods which lie at the heart of our food system. Hitler's chief propagandist said, "You tell people a lie often enough and they will believe it." What are the two falsehoods that lie at the heart of the food system? We need capital-intensive agriculture because, secondly, only capital-intensive agriculture can feed 10 billion people. But we've already seen that the world produces enough food. And we also have to ask the question, who produces it? Here we have, you can't really see it, but I'll explain it to you, a range of crops on the vertical axis and a range of regions around the world. And the key thing to take away is that the purple and the blue lines together are farms of less than 20 hectares. Right? Farms of less than 20 hectares. So small and medium scale farms. And what do you see? Well, in China, you're talking about more than 75% of all food grown on small and medium scale farms. East Asia and the Pacific, more than 60% of all food grown on medium and small scale farms. In South Asia, almost 90% of all food grown on medium and small scale farms. Sub-Saharan Africa, more than 80% of all food grown on medium and small scale farms. It's smallholder agriculture around the world that grows an immense amount of the world's food. So if we want to ask who feeds the world, we have to recognize that industrial agriculture feeds us, but it doesn't feed the world. It's small-scale agriculture which feeds the world. The second point about a new food system is something that's been established through countless scientific studies that I want to review. Briefly, because we're running out of time, but I will review it nonetheless. And that is that agroecological farming can be as productive or more productive than industrial agriculture. That agroecological farming can be as profitable or more profitable than industrial agriculture. That we can feed the world agroecologically. Now, before I explain what agroecological farming is, let me show you a couple of charts. First one. This comes from the Rothamsted Research Institute in England. It is the oldest agricultural research center in the world. And it's over the period of time. You've got figures about the productivity of wheat. Unmanured, using inorganic fertilizers, using organic manure only, using the best inorganic fertilizers, using the best organic manures. It is quite striking to me what has the highest level of productivity in the world's oldest agricultural research institute looking at wheat. It is the organics, not the inorganics. Now, this led me to a question. How systematic is this relationship? And so in my last paper that I've been working on, what I've tried to review in part of the paper are what we call meta-studies. Meta-studies look at a huge number of studies and compile them together to look for trends in multiple studies. So meta-studies can comb over hundreds and sometimes thousands of studies in order to establish relationships. And so what I wanted to look at was, what do the meta-studies of the last 10 years tell us about the yields that are generated and the profitability that's generated if we compare organic or agroecological farming to conventional farming? And I would suggest to you that there are 2 points which emerge from the meta-studies. The first point is that the presumed superiority of conventional or industrial farming is not proven. There are lots of examples in which either organic or agroecological farming can be shown to be as or more productive, despite the fact that conventional agriculture receives, according to Eric Holt-Jimenez, 99% of agricultural research funding that's allocated in the world. So the second point I draw from this particular table is that circumstances do exist where agroecology can produce more than enough food to feed people. We can feed the world agroecologically. So we need to facilitate a widening and a deepening of agroecological farming practices. We need to do this to stop climate change and to stop the ecological destruction of the biophysical resources on which farming depends. So what does agroecology entail? It entails optimizing the sustainable use of low-impact local resources. It requires minimizing the use of high-impact farm technologies. This is done in order to sustain soils and micronutrients upon which our food depends. I haven't shown it to you, but over the last 50 years, our food is becoming steadily less nutritious. If you want to get the omega oils from a chicken that you would have eaten in 1960, in 2017, you've got to eat 5 chickens. We need, in order to do this, to adapt farm input and output choices to reflect the ecosystem and the landscape. Because industrial agriculture tries to shape the landscape around its requirements. Instead, we need to farm according to what the landscape can bear, while all the same time trying to sustain and indeed enhance crop yields in order to increase agricultural surpluses. Now, the reason we need to foster agroecology is because it is far more resilient to environmental and economic shocks. And with the process of climate change, I would expect more environmental shocks. It's also more labor-intensive, and we're moving into a period of global development which has been increasingly jobless And so we need to think about ways of creating jobs for people. But most importantly, agroecology historically has been the foundation of local communities and food systems, which, through mechanisms of social reciprocity, have ensured adequate, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food for all. A right to food which was not based upon money, but was based upon being a member of a community. Historically, agroecology promotes a system in which food is not necessarily a commodity. So we can build a food system that sustains the ecology of the planet and meets the challenge of a growing population. We can build a food system which sustains a global right to food, which mitigates climate change, which sustains a living livelihood for billions of people, and which addresses the structural tendencies towards deepening social inequalities that we witness around the world. And to do this, we need to build something which is called food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is based on the rights of peoples and countries to define their own agricultural and food policy. It's based on the right of farmers to not only produce the crops that they want to produce, but to receive a price for their crops which reflects their actual costs of production and not world market prices. Food sovereignty requires that eaters be adequately informed so that they can decide what it is they're consuming. Go into a supermarket, look at the food label. How many ingredients in the processed food do you not even know what they are? Yeah? It's so common. Look at the labeling of your meat. What do you learn from it? You don't learn what's gone into it. You don't understand the terms and conditions by which it's been raised. Food sovereignty requires the rights of peoples and countries to decide how food is going to be grown and by whom. And this in turn requires protecting both eaters and farmers from international food dumping, the things which undermine livelihoods around the world of small-scale subsistence farmers, because those dumped food supplies are subsidized by the Americans and by the European Union. And so food sovereignty requires the protection of national agricultures from dumped or low-price agricultural imports. It finally requires the phasing out of government measures created to promote unsustainable agriculture. Because one of the things about subsidies is subsidies don't go to farmers, subsidies go to industrial agriculture in the developed world. Food sovereignty is a movement for a new food system. It's pushed globally by the global peasant movement La Via Campesina. La Via Campesina has 200 million affiliated members around the world. It is the world's largest social movement. It's in Bonn right now, trying to deal with COP. We can create a new food system, but it's not just that we can, we have to. Because climate change will wreck us, and our current agricultural system is killing the climate. Thank you.
So you take some questions?
Yeah.
Great.
That was a, you need to take a big breath of air. That was a very comprehensive, very compelling, very hard-hitting, and a lecture with a very constructive, politicized, and fantastic Haroon. We have some time for a few questions. So Haroon is very kindly. So I guess I'll just stand up here and try and recognize people. And the floor is open. Please. If you could please speak up. We don't have mics today. So.
Sure. So one thing that I was wondering was where you were speaking about agroecology and how that can be, I guess, in part achieved by food
Sovereignty.
You're saying, so about what types of global, the types of global economic changes that are required to create these types of changes, and with the goal of how that can be achieved.
So the question is, what type of global economic changes would be required to build some kind of food sovereign food system? Well, in fact, I wrote an article about this about 2 years ago, about the kinds of concrete changes that are needed, right? And the several things that I would point out in terms of thinking about how we can build a different kind of food system. On a global scale, we need to rethink the institutions which regulate the world economy. And there's one institution in particular that I would pay attention to. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the World Bank and the IMF were created. And when they were created by Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes, the idea behind these institutions is that they would be under the auspices of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and that they would help reconstruct the world in the aftermath of World War II. But there was a third institution, which for Keynes in particular was absolutely central. And this was something that he called the International Trade Organization. Now, the International Trade Organization is not like our World Trade Organization. The role of the International Trade Organization was to have been to maintain global full employment by managing trade across frontiers. And as part of that in farming, it was to manage the supplies of farm goods to ensure balanced trade around the world. Now, that kind of trade organization is something that I think is absolutely central to the establishment of a new food system. Because what that would do is it would put employment at the heart of the global economic order, number one. What it would do is it would ensure that farmers, when they were producing, would get a price for their crops which guaranteed them a viable livelihood. And it would also ensure that global food supplies were distributed around the world from places that produced things to places that didn't produce things. So this idea of creating an international trade organization is absolutely central to my thinking. But the thing about an international trade organization is it can only be created by political pressure. Yeah? It's not going to come about just of its own accord. So this is where the politics come in. A political movement that's required to start to change the terms and conditions by which economies operate. But the thing about a political movement to change the terms and conditions by which economies operate is that the world economy is such an abstract thing. How can you change the way the world economy works? Well, you can't. But you can change the way economies operate through local politics. Yeah? If we wanted to seriously institute something like the labeling of products as whether they've got GMOs, the most sensible way of doing that here in Canada is to choose the smallest, most powerful jurisdiction and pile into that to try and get them to introduce GMO labeling. You know what that would be? Prince Edward Island. 100,000 people, and it's a province. All politics in PEI are local. You start a movement for GMO labeling in PEI, you change the provincial laws, and all of the Maritimes are going to get GMO labeling. So local politics has ripple effects well beyond the local. By building up local movements, local food movements for transformational change, you can start to change the terms and conditions by which municipal governments operate, by which provincial governments operate, and yes, eventually, by which national governments operate. And it's national governments coming together, like-minded national governments. These are the institutions which can change the way in which the global economy is structured.
A field trip to PEI, that sounds good. Yes, please.
Hello. I was just wondering, earlier you showed a slide sort of showing the differences in how Westerners eat a lot compared to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, was this sort of always so, or did how Westerners, as in Europeans, start eating substantially more meat since
Okay, so the question is, have high levels of European meat consumption been historically the case? Well, the short answer to that is that the highest levels of European meat consumption actually occurred in the 14th century. In the 14th century, the Black Death took place. A third of Europe's population in some places died in a matter of days. And the thing about the Black Death then is that when people died, it meant more meat was available per person. More meat being available per person, that lasted for about a century, particularly in Germany, but not just in Germany. It was also in Britain, it was also in the Low Countries, and it was in northern France. And then, as population started to recover, you then had circumstances in which people were consuming so much meat that it was difficult for growing populations to access basic food grains. And thus, in the 15th century, you started to see localized famines. And the response of Europe to that was colonialism. That's where colonial rule came from. 4 days after Columbus made first contact with the New World, 2 of his crewmen came back and said that they had discovered an Indian grain which the locals call something like maize. Within 40 years, maize became a staple food crop of West Africa. Yeah? So you see this globalization of food happening around the 15th and the 16th centuries, driven by a European desire to maintain food consumption in light of heavy meat consumption, not just among elites. Yeah? So historically, it was the 14th century.
Yes, a question here?
I have a personal question.
A personal question.
We are aware of this report. We understand it. We have the solutions as hard as well. We know all the solutions to this problem. But yet still, it still continues. And it will continue. My question is, do you believe that the morals of integrity is the biggest reason why these solutions are not being implemented?
Are the morals of integrity the biggest reason why these changes are not being introduced? What do you mean by the morals of integrity?
As in integrity as who are in charge?
Well, you know, there I've got to resurrect my old structuralism. I'm not going to focus too much on individual motivations. I'm interested more in the way the system operates, because systems very often impose behaviors upon people. And when systems impose behaviors upon people, they do things which in other circumstances they would not necessarily do. Yeah? Systems can be the result of path dependence historically. Yeah? I mean, for example, you know, I would not hold any individual accountable in 2017 for colonialism, not any individual. Yeah? The structural conditions by which people are operating in 2017 do reflect the aftermath of the colonial period. But you can't hold an individual responsible for that. Yeah? It's important to think about the way in which individual actors as agents can shape their world around them. And the responsibility for that starts with us as individuals. Yeah? If you lead that moral life, you shape the lives of the people around you. And by shaping the lives of the people around you, you change your communities. And when communities change, regions change. This is not something which is an overnight, this isn't some sort of historic epochal break. It's not October the 7th, 1917. Social change is gradual, but it does happen. It absolutely does happen.
Yes, there's a question here and then a question here. Please. And then a question there.
So we talk about sovereign countries, right? So the food system being sovereign. My question is, there's so many countries in the world where resources are not so equal. Like there are few countries where you simply cannot farm because of weather conditions and because of different factors.
Mhm.
So how can these countries be sovereign in their production?
So what are the countries where you cannot farm because of weather?
Like, it's difficult to farm, I would say, in the Middle East. I would say a lot of, like, many parts of Africa, there's severe drought.
But I've just come back from drought-ridden regions where everyone is farming. Yeah? And in the Middle East, there's absolutely no doubt that Israeli agricultural technologies are incredible in the way in which they economize on water and generate huge agricultural surpluses. It is true that the Middle East is a strongly water-stressed region of the world, without a doubt. And it's also true that attempts that happened over the course of the last 40 years to try and create, as happened in Saudi Arabia, wheat-growing regions in Saudi Arabia. This is a huge misuse of resources. The fundamental point is that food production, number one, is more than enough for everybody. It is the case that some parts of the world are more stressed than others. But surely, if we start to think about food being a right based upon mechanisms of reciprocity rather than commodification, if we start to think about those sorts of mechanisms, then we'll start to deal with the areas where food is more stressed.
Thank you. Question here and then a question here.
Do you believe that the dairy industry is also plays a significant role in global food insecurity, just like the meat industry, because it's so connected?
Yeah. No, the global dairy industry is particularly pernicious. But it's not particularly pernicious on its own. It's implicated in a range of other things. So, because of dairy subsidies in the United States in the 1970s, 1980s, the Americans ended up with a huge surplus of cheese, right? So what are you going to do with all that cheese? Great idea. Let's have pizza. But it's true. When Paul and I were young, pizza would not have been an everyday event. You'd have it occasionally, right? I think I maybe had it once every 3 or 4 months, right? And the idea that you'd get it frozen in the supermarket, no, it wasn't there. So, in fact, pizza became a way of the United States food manufacturers to dispose of excess dairy products, right? And in order to make those last a long time, you stuff them full of soy oil. And to make them last, make sure you're going to eat them, you stuff them full of high fructose corn syrup. And bingo, everyone's putting on weight because everyone is eating too much pizza. Yeah? So, yes, the dairy industry is implicated in doing this. And if you compare this, for example, to the French dairy industry, yeah? You know, the French dairy industry, the dairy products are channeled into high quality, not always, some of them are industrial, but high quality products much more commonly than they are in our dairy sector.
So there was a yes, please.
So you kind of touched on the idea of it's important not to have nutritious food, but also culturally appropriate.
Yes.
But how would you kind of balance that or reconcile that with the fact that so many food cultures around the world are predominantly meat-based, especially in kind of Western Europe and kind of America, these kind of local food cultures are predominantly meat-based.
Okay, so the question is, if you're going to have culturally appropriate food, how do you reconcile that with the fact that people eat so much meat? Well, you start educating people that your meat consumption is killing the planet. It's that simple. That's number one. Number two, I'm not suggesting that anyone should become vegetarian. I'm not. I'm suggesting a couple of other things. First of all, eat less meat, right? Pay for meat, not on the basis of what's cheapest, but pay for meat on the basis of taking account of the environmental and health consequences of that meat consumption over time. If you do that, the price of your meat's going to go up. So your meat is then no longer the centerpiece of what you eat, it's the condiment. It's the thing that you use on the side to give it the additional kick, the additional flavor. That's the way to eat meat. And that's the way to eat meat in a far more sustainable way. And so you're not going to give up the meat. You're just going to eat less of it. If you want to do as a group one thing for the planet. One thing. Eat less meat. Please.
So I have two more questions here, and maybe I can find one more if I see a hand, and then we probably will have to wrap it up. Okay, two more. You're first, and you're second.
Okay, so you said that the EU and the US are in charge of the food dumping, and I'm guessing they're getting a good amount of economic profit from it, right?
What happens is the Americans and the Europeans subsidize their farmers. They subsidize some of their farmers. About a quarter of farms receive 3/4 of subsidies, for example, in the United States. Now, those farmers are subsidized in two sorts of ways. First of all, they are paid for the crops that they produce, number one. The second thing that happens is that exports are very often subsidized if there's surplus production. Now, farmers themselves, they're simply looking at costs and revenues. Once the product is sold to the traders, they don't know what happens to it. The traders make money because they're selling things in heavily regulated, monopolistic global markets. But they don't have to charge high prices to make money off of that. They simply have to shift large volumes of the product. Okay? So
Wait, so my question is, how much can the US and the EU in a way veto this food sovereignty program?
oh, completely. Completely. When I say you've got to get rid of measures which sustain unsustainable agriculture, get rid of the subsidies, these are the things that we're talking about. You've got to eliminate American and European farm subsidies. Absolutely. And the thing about this is you could say in the United States Midwest or the Canadian West, eliminate subsidies, you're going to drive farmers to the wall. The issue is, small-scale farmers in Canada and the United States don't get the subsidies. It's the large-scale farmers that are going to be driven to the wall. And those are precisely the farms which are disproportionately contributing to the climate crisis.
So what I'm going to ask actually is if we can have each of the three questioners ask their question first, and then we'll give Haroon a chance to sort of answer them all with a big bag at the end. So if you could start, please.
My question is, in the past, how have marginalized groups of people like smallholder farmers, how have they mobilized to fight against the systemic and create systemic evil?
Great question. Yes.
I'm wondering if how you systems like supply management in
Yeah.
your industry
Right. Okay. Yep.
I think it's estimated that about 50% of Canadian farmers are looking to retire within the next 10 years, and there's no succession from the government.
Yep.
I'm interested in your thoughts on government policy.
Okay. These are actually three very big questions. So the first question was, what are the experiences of mobilizing small-scale farmers to struggle for reforms to the system? Well, the reality is that there's a global struggle of small-scale farmers in different countries and at different times when they have tried to take on state authorities to restructure rural relations to their advantage. Yeah? So what sort of movements are we talking about here? I think the biggest and most interesting one, less successful in the last 10 years probably, but very interesting still, Brazil's landless workers movement. The landless workers movement was particularly concerned with people who had left the countryside and moved into slums and couldn't get work, and they realized they had no future, and so their families left and decamped to wait to try and seize land so that it could be farmed. And when the Lula government was first elected, the land seizures, which the landless workers movement did by placing people on land, the Ministry of Agrarian Reform recognized those seizures and let the people have that land. Because there's a clause in the Brazilian Constitution, and that clause says that if land is not fulfilling a social purpose, it can be redistributed. And so the MST, the Landless Workers Movement, said, we're redistributing land that isn't serving a social purpose. Government recognized it. Around the world, many things can be done to support small-scale subsistence farmers, but they don't necessarily even have to come from below. One of the most successful supports of small-scale farmers happened in the 1970s in West Bengal, and it was called Operation Barga. Barga is the Bengali word for sharecroppers. Sharecroppers, they rent land and they give a share of what they produce to the landlord. And historically, sharecroppers are highly exploited and highly insecure in their position. So, in 1977, in West Bengal, a communist government is elected. And the communist government, unlike many communist governments around the world, doesn't want to have its base of support in the cities. It actually wants to have its base of support in the countryside. And so it realizes it has to gain the support of the sharecroppers. So what does it do? It enacts laws to give sharecroppers security of tenure, number one. The second thing it does is it enacts laws which mean that landlords cannot evict tenants. And when landlords try and evict tenants, the police come after the landlords. The police were told to side with the tenants, not the landlords. The result was that the Communist Party of India, Marxist, was re-elected for 40 years because of Operation Barga. There's lots of ways in which people challenge sources of authority and power around the world. And it's not just from below, it can be in conjunction with the state. Supply management. The thing about supply management is a system in which the products of a large number of farmers are brought together into one lot, if you like, and then that is sold, the idea being if you sell a large volume of it, you're going to get a better price because you're going to be in a stronger position. So, what's the evidence of that in Canada? The evidence of supply management in Canada is that it substantially improves farmers' income security. When the Canadian Wheat Board was abolished a few years ago by the Canadian government, the impact of this on many small and medium farmers in the West was a precipitous decline in their living standards because they used to sell their wheat to the Canadian Wheat Board, primarily Manitoba and Saskatchewan, a few in Alberta, but not so many in Alberta. They'd sell their wheat to the Wheat Board, and the Wheat Board marketed Canadian wheat as being of better quality than that of the United States because we didn't interfere with the food system as much as the Americans. And this led to huge expansions of wheat sales, but through the Canadian Wheat Board, benefiting Canadian farmers. I think supply management is actually quite integral to food sovereignty, which is not to say that supply management is perfect, and it's not to say that there are abuses, because there are. But one of the things you learn as you get older in this game is you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Final point, young farmers. Well, ironically enough, I'm co-principal investigator of a 4-country research project which looks at this particular problem. How are we going to get people into secure farming in Canada? The average age of the Canadian farmer is now upwards of 56 years old. They're going to retire. There's no succession plan in many instances about who's going to take over these farms. So the question becomes, who is going to feed us? Now, this comparative research project deals with Canada, China, India, and Indonesia. What we have found so far, based upon desk studies, because the Manitoba field work is finished but hasn't been analyzed, and the Ontario field work, we're starting that next month. But based upon the desk studies that we've done, is the number one obstacle to young people getting into farming is land. Here's the thing that most people don't know since 2007, the food price crisis. What has been the best equity class to invest in? Your money, if you're a financial institution. It's not stocks. It's not gold. It's not platinum. It's farmland. The rate of growth of the price of farmland has been astronomically higher than other potential assets in Canada, in the United States, in Western Europe, in Ukraine, in Russia. It really is quite remarkable. And as a consequence of this, in Western Canada, financial companies are buying up farmland and then renting them back to farmers. The farmers are selling the land because they're so heavily in debt, this allows them to get out of that debt. But the consequence of this for young farmers is, how do you get into it? Now, there's a number of mechanisms that we don't really have time to go into, but there are ways in which we can encourage young people to get into farming. But the key thing is, number one, they have to have access to land, number one. Number two, you have to create a system in which farming becomes a viable livelihood for young people. And when I say viable, what I really mean is a middle-class lifestyle. But it's important to say that if we go back 40 years, farming was a middle-class lifestyle for Canadian farmers. And what's the defining characteristic for me? It's very pragmatic. Can you afford to send your kids to university? 40 years ago, farmers could. Now it only happens with state support. Not only that, 40 years ago, farmers in Fiji could send their kids to university. They can't anymore. Yeah? Farming has been systematically restructured over the course of the past 40 years. We need to change the terms and conditions by which farms operate in order to get young people into farming.